Welcome everyone to our panel discussion, Whose City? Urban Struggles in the Age of Gentrification. My name is Robin Celikates, and I'm very happy to welcome all of you on behalf of Critical Theory in Berlin and the Berlin Center for Humanities and Social Change, which I co-direct, to this in-context event, which continues some of the discussions we've started to have at the center before the pandemic struck and also during the pandemic on the right to the city, the question of expropriation and the common good. And I'm very glad that we can continue these discussions today, focusing on urban struggles. Now, gentrification and neoliberalization have shaped the cities we live in, but they have also given rise to a whole variety of urban struggles, from uprisings and riots to social movements advocating for rent control and for tenants' rights. And today we would like to discuss the dynamics shaping the city, both as a field of social and political protests and as an object of those protests and movements. We ask what possibilities and limitations characterize the various forms of urban struggle, and to what extent they are able to not just disrupt maybe politics as usual, but also to create concrete alternatives and to transform urban politics. Now, looking at Berlin alone, the last weeks and months have actually been quite instructive. Despite the pandemic, there has been a lot of movement, to say it that way. We witnessed large demonstrations against the eviction of squats, against gentrification, for the right to the city. But we also saw the campaign Deutsche Wohnen enteignen, expropriate Deutsche Wohnen, making its next steps towards the referendum on expropriating Berlin's biggest landlord, Deutsche Wohnen. If you haven't signed yet, please don't forget to do so. You still have a couple of weeks' time, and please tell others you know to do so as well. That would be quite an important step and signal in the struggle for a city that is more democratic and belongs to everyone. Now, for today's panel discussion, we're extremely happy to have two guests whose work is of great theoretical and political significance with regard to the question of urban struggles and the city today. I welcome Lisa Vollmer and Mustafa Dikeç, and also Christian Volk, who's going to chair the discussion together with me. Lisa Vollmer is a researcher and lecturer at the Institute for European Urban Studies at Bauhaus University in Weimar, and a member of the Berlin-based political initiative Stadt von unten, City from Below. Her work is primarily on urban social movements, on gentrification and on housing, and among her most recent publications is a little book that I can really recommend, Strategien gegen Gentrifizierung, that appeared in 2018. Welcome, Lisa. Mustafa Dikeç is professor of urban studies at the École d'Urbanisme de Paris and a researcher at Malmö University in Sweden. His work is located at the intersection of space and politics, urban uprisings, and temporal urban infrastructures. And his most recent book, which I can't show you because it's on my iPad with which I'm now talking to you, but Chris has it in his hand and shows it, is called Urban Rage, The Revolt of the Excluded, and came out in 2017. And Christian Volk, who's a professor of political theory at Humboldt University, joins me as chair of the panel discussion. So welcome to all of you. I'm very glad that we can have this debate today.
Yeah, thank you, Robin. It's a pleasure to be part of this debate, and a warm welcome from my side as well. So let us start our conversation by taking stock of the current dynamics that shape urban politics in the global north. What are the structural transformations we need to take into consideration in order to understand urban conflicts today? So keywords are gentrification and neoliberal urban governance, which deepened societal inequalities. In your work, Lisa, you provide a lucid account of neoliberal urban governance when you write that, on the one hand, responsibility has been shifted to the individual, but on the other hand, the individual is denied the right to real political participation. In this vein, you sharply distinguish between a culturalist understanding of gentrification and one in terms of political economy. Your criticism is also with regard to some protest initiatives that in the public perception of gentrification, a culturalist interpretation prevails, which associates gentrification with latte macchiato, art galleries, hipsters, and fancy playgrounds. And this interpretation, you argue, ignores the existential threat tenants experience. It obscures the fact that housing provision is organized in commodity terms, and it fails to understand that the real drivers and profit makers of gentrification are the real estate industry and some municipal governments. So before we ask about the extent to which political protest is inflamed by neoliberal urban governance, I would like to ask you to explain to us how gentrification is part and parcel of neoliberal urban governance and how we should account for its economic dimension and the political will and agenda that lurks behind it.
Thank you for the question. Indeed, I think there is, at least in the German public discourse, there is the picture of gentrification very dominant, especially in the press, that pictures it as a process in which, expensive cafes open and then people go and buy expensive coffee and then it's their fault that people get displaced. And I not only think that this kind of moral discussion leads nowhere. We could, then go and talk to those people and tell them not to buy this coffee, but this would take a lot of time as a political strategy and also it's not that useful. But it shifts away the attention from who's actually profiting from gentrification, that is the real estate industry behind these processes. So gentrification, as the term in itself says, means the displacement of poor people by households with more income who can pay higher rents or can pay more for buying their home. And so poor people lose their not only their home but also their networks, their neighborly networks, which are more important to poor households than they are to richer ones for their to dealing with their daily life. And this process of gentrification is an important part of neoliberal urbanism. It's both a strategy by the real estate industry to gain profit, but also it's also part of neoliberal urban governance. So under Fordist urbanism, municipalities saw it as their duty to deliver public services to their citizens, and in neoliberal urbanism they see it as their duty to secure profits for private interests, but also to secure that there is a middle class and upper classes living in their cities, so they can collect taxes from them. So gentrification can also be an explicit urban strategy by governments to change the demographic of a neighborhood. That is usually then covered with the rhetoric of social mixing. So usually, municipal government wouldn't say we want to get rid of these poor people, but they would say this neighborhood has a bad social mix, and we need to better this social mix. They never say that about rich neighborhoods, of course. They only say that about poor neighborhoods, and I think that's an interesting strategy. They also never talk about people. They talk about the spaces as if they were people. So we need to make this neighborhood better. But if you make the neighborhood better and then all the people that originally lived there are gone, then it doesn't help them at all. So gentrification, to come back to your question, is an important part of neoliberal urbanism, both as a side effect, so to speak, of letting the real estate industry do as they wish, but also as a intended political strategy, as a population strategy, basically.
Great, thanks. So we'll come back to this idea of the population politics. I think that's an extremely important part of the process that you describe. But I would like to turn to you, Mustafa, to invite you to expand on this from your perspective. I mean, in your work, you argue that the geographies of urban protests, of urban revolts, that they overlap with the geographies of mass unemployment, of discrimination, and of repression. And these geographies, they have been both expanding and intensifying over the last decades. And you studied this in a comparative perspective, looking at cities from the US, Sweden, France, but also Greece, Turkey, and other countries. And as you point out, the resulting socioeconomic inequalities, the also racist exclusions, the populational dynamics that Lisa has also pointed to, and the increasing repression that goes hand in hand with these dynamics, they sort of totally fly in the face of the official self-understanding of liberal democracies in the way in which they also celebrate the city as a kind of open space where everyone can find their home, etc. So just on a kind of general level, I mean, how would you characterize the cities we live in that have gone through this kind of structural transformation? Are they the dynamic and kind of pluralist spaces of democratic public life as which they are often presented, or are they rather, just symptoms of the failure of liberal democracies to live up to their promise?
Thank you. I think it's both, but I think I'd like to emphasize more the aspect that it shows a failure of these liberal democracies. Liberal democracies don't have any problem with people having increasing inequalities. That's the problem. I mean, as long as they are provided with equal political opportunities formally, not maybe in real life, the increasing inequalities will not be a problem in liberal democracies, as long as they assume that the democratic institutions are working fine in their formal ways of working. But we know that that's not how things are. And we know that, Lisa talked about this, but all these very strong forces on cities with the financialization of urban space and with the this is not unprecedented, of course. I mean, we saw this in 19th century Paris too, this huge speculative things. But what's happening now, it seems to me, is that especially the more disadvantaged groups, I use this reservedly for lack of a better term, but let's say stigmatized groups, Kurdish neighborhoods in Turkey, Black neighborhoods in the UK, Black Asian minority ethnic neighborhoods in the UK, Black neighborhoods in the United States, North African origin neighborhoods in France, non-ethnic neighborhoods in Sweden. They are under a double squeeze in this, and we can accept the culturalist and economic interpretations of neoliberalism and gentrification. But on the one hand, we have this enormous economic pressure that comes from on all sides with precarious jobs, increasing inequalities, growing poverty, and all that. And on the other, it seems to me that the groups, both racially and class-wise, that suffer most from these kinds of increasing pressures, economic, are squeezed from the other side by a culturalist pressure, which is they are somehow seen as parts that don't fit in, problems to be fixed. And as Lisa said, this usually takes different technical terms like social mixing, which becomes a coded way of talking about poor people, and generally we are talking global north, right? Non-white neighborhoods. So I think that leaves them in a really, really tough place, because it also limits the ways in which such populations can respond to such kind of interventions in their living spaces, because they are stigmatized and usually faced with repressive forces of the state.
But would you, just to have one follow-up, and would you say that this has always been the true character of the liberal city? You mentioned 19th century Paris, or is it like a wave movement? I mean, how would you describe the historical dynamic in this process?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I don't know if I can answer it, authoritatively, because I've been reading about 19th century Paris and about speculation towards the end of the century, and which ended up in crash, of course, the crash of the stock exchange. But now it seems to me that there's another dimension, let's call it the racial dimension. which is very strong, especially in the past decades, the increasing culture war, so to speak. I'm not saying this is unprecedented, but I think this is one aspect that comes across very strongly when we look at, my area of research is urban protest, especially riots and uprisings. In almost every one of them, this aspect is there.
Lisa, you touched upon this issue, namely how a specific mode of production of the city, of the urban, is also intertwined with the specific types of protest. In your work, I found this inspiring and thought-provoking remark that Berlin's tenants movement does not only have its origin not in leftist structures, but the still existing structures of the squatters movement hardly offer any stimulus for new forms of organization of tenants movements. And the reason you give is that the squatters' struggles for autonomous lifestyles and against the Fordist production of housing differ tremendously from today's challenge caused by neoliberal production of the city. And I would like to elaborate on this and explain this to us a bit. And additionally, you say that if squatting is discussed within tenants movement, they are more inspired by protest activities in Spain or Italy performed by migrant workers or evicted people there. So the follow-up would be then, what can we learn? What lessons can we learn from this type of protest activity?
Yeah, okay. So that's a very complex question. Usually there's also a lot of misunderstandings, at least in the German context, when we talk about the squatters movement. And so let me first say that we need to distinguish between squatting as just one form among many of action within urban struggles. Squatting, whatever you like. There's a lot of groups employ this form of action, and the squatters movement in Berlin around 1980 and after 1990. So this were really the squatters movement, which were also very heterogeneous, had very different motives, and cannot be the picture I paint is a bit of a broad stroke, I would say. But the argument in my book about tenant protest in Berlin and New York is that I distinguish between different phases of this tenant protest. I have a little historical part about tenant protest in the 19th century, where I do this with regulation theory, right? I say that there's a laissez-faire capitalism and urbanism in the 19th century, then it comes into crisis, and this is when a lot of urban struggles happen. Also, this is when we have a lot of tenant protest in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. And then we have, after the Second World War, we have Fordist urbanism. And when Fordist urbanism comes into crisis in the 60s and 70s, again, there's a new wave of urban protests and also a new cycle of tenant protest. And in this time, the tenant protest reacts to this specific mode of governance. In general, over the different phases of tenant protest, the underlying problem stays the same, right? The housing question stays the same. It's about the contradiction of housing as a commodity on the one side and housing as a basic need on the other side. That doesn't change for the last 200 years, but the way that this contradiction is mediated by the state and by capital, that changes over time. So Fordist urbanism did this in a specific way, and then this mode of regulation comes into crisis, and we have this new cycle of tenant protest. And similar as what is called new social movements in this time in other fields, they deploy a political collectivity, that's the term I use, the political collectivity that is around autonomy and identity. And that makes sense because they are anti-hegemonical against a Fordism that tries to press everyone in a heteronormative nuclear family lifestyle model. So identitarian claims make sense to contradict that. And it also, the autonomy also makes sense because we have a very authoritative state that was very much, especially in the corporatist model of the German welfare state, was in housing particularly, was very much involved with the interests of capital, and it was state policies that led to the specific problems that tenants had in Berlin. So for them, it made sense to claim autonomy also from state institutions. And then my argument is that today we're in the crisis of neoliberalism that we have since the financial crisis at the latest, that the political collectivity that forms against this is different because neoliberalism is different. Under neoliberalism, you can have every identity you like. Neoliberalism loves it, makes it into a commodity and sells it to tourists. So it doesn't make sense to have this identitarian claims. Also the state, the social state retreated from public housing provision and so on. So it doesn't make sense to have this autonomous claims. So the political collectivity is very different from the ones of the so-called new social movements of the 70s. And the squatters movement, that still exists in Berlin partly and dates back to this time, is empirically it's not very related to this new cycle of tenant protest. That's just something you can see. Of course, there's solidarity statements from the tenant movement towards the squatters movement, very rarely the other way around. But in forms of actions, it's not that woven together. Maybe that's different in other cities in Germany, but in Berlin, it's quite separated. And there's also, ideological differences between them. And in my view, that is related to the fact that this former squatters movement that still make this claim for autonomous spaces and so on, that it doesn't really resonate with people's experience with neoliberalism. The tenant movement in Berlin was able to mobilize a lot of people, a lot of ordinary people that don't usually join this kind of protest, I would say. And the squatter movement is not able to do that because they are not able to present a political collectivity, a narrative, or whatever you want to call it, that people can relate to their experience of daily life under neoliberalism. That was the first part of your question, and the second part I already forgot, sorry.
The second part was about the lessons that could be learned from the situation of homeless migrant workers in Spain or Italy, because you said that might inspire the tenants movements to a greater extent than the history of the squatters movement in Berlin.
No, the squatting is employed by the tenant movement as a form of action. Even one of the most prominent squats, at least in my opinion, in the last couple of years here in Berlin was when a group of retirees, of senior citizens, squatted their senior center, which was because there was an eviction going on, and so this bunch of old people just slept there for 2 weeks, and this is also a form of squatting, right? It's not who you would expect to do that. And on the other hand, you have this traditional radical leftist groups that now collect signatures to expropriate this big financialized housing companies. So there's not this this form of action is not necessarily as linked to different ideologies as it was before, or as it is sometimes discussed now. And when I talked about in this book from that some groups rather look at what's happening in Spain than to the squatters movement. This was more about the what was happening with the protest against forced evictions in Spain, which was very huge and very also successful in political impact. So there are groups also in Germany that also use this name, Bündnis gegen Zwangsräumung or something like that, so Alliance Against Forced Evictions, that are inspired by practices in Spain, which are also, presenting themselves rather as unideological. Of course, they are leftist protests, but they are not, waving the flag for that that position in front of them.
So it's clear that there are different forms of urban politics, different forms of urban struggle. Lisa mentioned the Squatters movement and the tenants movement. Mustafa, you're primarily interested in urban revolts and uprisings, so more in, let's say, spontaneous insurrections rather than organized social movement like protest practices. And as I understand it, your position involves two central claims. I mean, the first is to say that, well, riots and uprisings are as political as these more organized, more claim-oriented movements that are maybe more readily read as political by the public sphere, by the media, by politicians. If a riot is happening, it's usually dismissed as a public order disturbance. The police is sent in. People even on the left, people complain it's not really political. These are just disoriented youth who loot a supermarket because they are too enchanted by the consumer society or something. Zizek and Badiou, make these claims. So you want to say, no, it is political and we have to read it as political. And secondly, it's political because it has a heuristic or disclosing function. It disrupts the kind of ideological veil that, displaces especially social, economic, and political structures of inequality and makes it seem as if, the city is there for everyone. So my question is basically, how would you situate the riots and uprisings you're interested in this broader field of urban struggles, especially in relation to the more organized movements that Lisa has talked about? Do you see points of connection? Do you think that these are just entirely separate phenomena and there's no real overlap?
I don't think there is a clear separation between them, but I can't tell if participants in the riots are necessarily part of other kinds of urban social movements. So that's hard to research. But Robin, let me tell you. Let me start with this idea about these riots being spontaneous. I picked the word very carefully because when there was a big wave of riots in France in 2005, which was the biggest disruption the country had experienced since 1968, Nicolas Sarkozy insisted that these were not spontaneous events, they were organized. And the reason he said this is that if they are organized, they are more open to criminal punishments if you're organized rather than spontaneous, because you are plotting against something, against the state, against armed social state at least. So that's my one reason why I use the word spontaneous. The other reason is that I haven't seen any incidents of people like organizing, coming together, oh, let's make a riot, that kind of thing, as if like organizing a demonstration. So it usually just erupts after, what James Baldwin called, like when the unimaginably bitter cup overflows. Just one more thing. But it's not a unique thing. It's been happening for years, maybe for decades. So in this sense, it's spontaneous. But it's not spontaneous if we think of spontaneity as if it just appeared out of nowhere. That's obviously not the case. There are very strong structural reasons behind this, and we can talk about it later on if you want. Now, I think you are absolutely spot on. I mean, the reason I wanted to claim these incidents as political is because of this disruption, and this has Rancierian inspirations. We can talk about it later on if necessary, but there is one qualification here, and that's equality. This equality is a claim for equality, fighting for equality is the acid test for these kinds of riots. Otherwise, Capitol riot will be political too if we think, like if we take every single disruption against the order as a political event. So this aspect of equality is key to me. And even if in these uprisings, we don't see, as you said, Robin, no clear articulations, messages. Sometimes we do, but sometimes we don't. We know exactly what's going on. We know exactly why they have started. We know exactly who the main targets are. It's almost always the police. The main target is almost always the police, and very, very rarely the people and property. But we can talk about this. I mean, what we are talking about is again, I use the term for lack of a better term, but we are talking about an oppressed people, right? And if the oppressed people are acting against an injustice, they have the right to do wrong, damage some property, that kind of thing. If we want to recognize the agency of the people, then we have to recognize that they have a right to commit wrongs when they are trying to address certain injustices. I don't want to take credit for this. I came across this idea in a book by Tommy Shelby. It's called Dark Ghettos, Injustice, Dissent, and Reform. And I thought it was a really good argument, because every time I talk about riots, in the audience, at least one person will say, yes, but what about those perfume stores and the stolen TVs? So yeah, we can talk about it. But I had my answers to it, but I was trying to come up with something a bit slightly deeper. So I thought this idea of the agency of the oppressed fighting against injustice really did it for me in this way. So yes, disruption, that's the political aspect, because that's when some things are disclosed. Think about the 2014 Ferguson riots, when this 18-year-old black teenager was shot 6 times, I think, and murdered, which then exposed the whole system of municipal police and municipal court preying on black residents for decades, making court fees the city's second biggest income resource after sales tax. We didn't know that. And we wouldn't have known that if these riots had not disclosed this for us. Of course, legal activists working in those areas know that, but let me put it this way: the world didn't know it, and now we know.
Just a brief follow-up on this, Robin, if you allow. I somehow detected 3 different components when you talk about the urban political. So one component seems to be this moment of undoing governing orders and hierarchies. So the moment of disruption, right, is the moment of politics. A second component seems to be this actualization of equality, which manifests, or which could manifest in these moments. And you referred to Rancière put it as an equality in war that exists in the moment of riots, street battles, and it is we need to transform this equality in war into something like political freedom. But I would like to know a bit more what kind of equality is this you have in mind there. And the third component is, I read this in a different paper. I think, I don't know which one of yours it was. You invented this phrase, reflexive withdrawal. The reflexive withdrawal from the accepted given. Though there's a moment of reflexivity. And I was wondering, for whom? Is it about triggering public awareness processes, or where is this reflexivity situated?
Excellent. And very difficult. Thank you. Let me see. So yes, Chris, you're absolutely right. So there are these 3 components. One of them is this undoing the order, disrupting. Let's put it this way. It's at least momentarily, because the riots are different from, let's say, revolutionary programs. So they will peter out. They're not going to last very long. So, but during that moment, the brief period of time, there is a disruption of ordinary ways of doing things. So suddenly, let's say, I don't have naive ideas about like rioters facing the police and that kind of thing. It's a horrible thing in many ways. But yeah, there's a moment there when the oppressed are facing the oppressors. in equal terms. And I don't want to, what's the word? It's escaping me.
Glorify
This. Yes, please don't get me wrong. That's not what I mean. But there is something else is going on. For the first time, the police is scared too. That's one thing. The other thing, the actualization of equality. I don't think, actually, I should have been more careful about this. Now, when you asked the question, I thought about it. The riots, I don't think they are necessarily actualization of equality as such. I mean, of course, they are actualizations of equality if you think that a group of oppressed people are for the first time raising their voices and making, let's get very Arendtian, making public appearances, like constructing themselves as subjects in the public space. That will be equality. But the aspect what I was more interested in is that let me give the Capitol riot as a counter example. None of those people participating in the Capitol riot was asking for equality of anyone for anyone. Whereas I'm pretty sure most, if not all, of the participants in Black Lives Matter, in the protests that followed George Floyd's murder, they were asking for equality of anyone with anyone, basically. So that's the, I should have made this distinction. So that's the kind of equality I have in mind. But now I have two equalities. So thank you for allowing me to elaborate this. The reflexive withdrawal, I think that was inspired by Hannah Arendt. And it's because I tried to come up with an idea of politics as a ways of perceiving the world and modes of relating to it. So ways of perceiving the world is about, how we perceive that, like our routinized reactions to the world and how we take them as granted, as normal, as the right or at least habitual way of doing these things. But when a disruption occurs, Hannah Arendt says, this is the moment to stop and think. And remember, Hannah Arendt is a theorist of action, but also she is also very interested in this moment of disruption when you stop. And I mean, I'm saying this in an abstract way. You stop and think. Is this how it should be? Or is this like, am I seeing something else than I used to see? So it's a reflexive withdrawal from our routinized ways of being in the world, let's say in the city, for the sake of argument, and questioning those things, those routines, those dynamics, those processes.
Yeah, I mean, I would be interested, Lisa, in how you classify these disruptive forms of political protest that Mustafa just described. I had the impression from reading your articles that you conceive of the urban political in a different way, namely in those moments when the German phrase is Prozesse der Erfahrungsvergemeinschaftung are initiated. So processes of establishing communal relationship based on shared but different experiences of deprivation and exclusion. So could you maybe elaborate on this a bit and say something whether or not these moments of disruption could play a greater role in establishing communal relationships?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I agree completely with Mustafa that also riots or uprisings or whatever you want to call them, Krawalle, Aufstände in German, are political events. But I think they have to be distinguished from social movements, or it makes heuristic sense to do so. Then that social movements are more organized, more long term, and so on. So yeah, it's not it's not about positioning one against the other. They're both part of political action in the city, and they have specific relations to each other. And in the theory that I used for my PhD to look at this political collectivity of tenant protest, I used Ernesto Laglau's theory, and I probably in a very specific reading I realized after talking to some people about it. But the way I read Laglau is that that in political moments, it's not only about disruption or being against something, about negative moments, so to speak, but for it to become at least a productive political movement, it also has to be positive. It also has to be for something. And that is what is, mostly missing from these riots, of course. So this is one thing I think is very important when we talk about moments of political moments in the city. So where is the positive image that people paint of what alternative futures or alternative cities they wanna have? And part of that is what I call there, using Karl Mannheim's cultural sociology, the Erfahrungsvergemeinschaftung. I don't know how you translated that now, the communalization of experiences, and that can be everything. Of course, also taking part in a riot and talking about it and stuff can become communal experience and a basis for a longer lasting social movement. But I think one thing that I didn't really also touch on in my PhD and this theory of riots and uprisings also doesn't really talk about, but is very, very important, is the fact that all of these people are acting in a terrain of the social devastation of institutions, of social institutions. So, that people have to riot, that's also a very, very sad thing, because they don't have other channels for their political activity, because they can't be in parties anymore, because they don't represent them, because the unions are so weak and are not fighting for their interests, and so on. So this question of political institutions, not state institutions, but of self-organized institutions and how they work, how they function, that is very important, and that's also a part of communalizing experiences, because there's so little knowledge, also with not only within riots, but also within the social movements, that has to be learned again, as if there was no labor movement for the past 150 years. But all of this seems, at least from what I can witness here in Berlin, people need to learn that again. Also, we need to build this kind of institutions, that there need to be accountability, and all of this stuff. So I think this is also a blind spot of a lot of the theory of urban political action that I know.
Yeah, Mustafa, please.
Can I just follow up on something? Lisa said something very important. I just want to, emphasize my consensus with that. As she said, riots are really a last resort when all the channels seem closed or where there are no channels at all. So I think that was a really good point. Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, maybe we can continue there, because we'd like to, before we open it up for the Q&A with the members of the audience, we would like to briefly at least turn to the future and the horizons of urban protest, to put it that way. It has already become clear, I think, that Mustafa, you caution against any kind of celebratory or romanticizing account of urban uprisings. In fact, you do point to the need to sort of move from, let's just say this more spontaneous outburst to more organized practices that aim in a more sustainable way, maybe, at radical transformation. What would you say are the prospects and what are the obstacles to that necessary step that needs to be taken, from the disruption to a more transformative, organized response? How optimistic in a way can we be in the face of the fact that the structural force of gentrification has already been at work for quite a long time? It has shaped the terrain of struggle really to the disadvantage of those movements. So, one could maybe wonder, is there actually more space, quite literally more space for, or the necessary space for more than local and defensive or disruptive actions? What's the prospect for that kind of transformative political force that you and Lisa both seem to agree is really necessary here?
We're going to end on a bleak note, because you know what my answer will be. There's not much. I think this connects to something Lisa said earlier in her first response, I think as long as urban space, because we are talking about space. I mean, we can talk about like mineral extraction and its injustices, that kind of thing. But since we have an urban focus here, as long as urban space remains prioritized over real people living in cities, I see very little prospect of having a transformative politics about this. So I think one aspect will be to change this economic rationality. I mean, we can associate it with neoliberalism, this mentality of it. I think one aspect would be this. The second one is, I mean, that's more close to home, is the increasing stigmatization and oppression of non-white populations in, let's say, Western cities. So that limits all kind of political protest and opposition, because what it does is, in theoretical terms, again, coming back to Rancière, it always draws you back to your proper place. Or you're saying this because are you an Arab? Are you black? And so you almost have no right to make a claim on the community as an equal. You are always pulled back to your imagined subject positions. Or you're thinking like this because you're probably Turkish. That's why you're doing this. So you see what I'm saying? So as long as this like pulling people down to their imagined places is not dealt with, and I don't know how to do this, it will be very difficult to establish a community of people with equal and equally legitimate voices. I'm sorry if this sounds too bleak, but that's how I feel.
Yeah, no, that's if that's how it is, then that's how we should face it. I mean, just one. I'll hand it over to you in a sec, Chris. But I mean, on the other hand, couldn't you also say that there are, some openings? I mean, the whole discussion about the Green New Deal in the U.S. does address urban inequality. The Black Lives Matter movement has made it, it's a strong part of their agenda. Nuit debout in Paris, Deutsche Wohnen enteignen in Berlin, which, it's really quite astonishing development. Barcelona and Comú and other, there are local, maybe glimmers of hope that we might also point to.
Yes. I don't want to, valorize those efforts and initiatives, but maybe it's part of my nature to focus on Black Lives Matter was very powerful. We were all very excited, that kind of thing. But then, one after the other, these police officers still killing people, still getting not convicted. And now we're going to wait and see what happens to Derek Chauvin, who is in trial now. So there are really deep problems that are very persistent, in my view, despite all the good glimmers of hope you mentioned, Robin. Yeah.
Lisa, in one of your articles, you claim that only an alliance between the poor and the middle class can achieve just housing in the long term. The internal temptations and external dangers of division must be fought together. This is a phrase that I translated from one of your articles. So, what kind of temptations and dangers do you have in mind here? What kind of temptations and dangers threaten a successful tenants movement, and what difficulties do you see for establishing a promising transformative strategy?
Yeah, I mean, that's also an empirical observation, right? That in the past, the only time that, the tenant movement could gain significant influence was when there was an alliance between poorer classes and the middle class. And that is because, for the middle class, the housing question pops up every 20 years or something. But for the poorer classes, it's there permanently. They're living in permanent crisis when it comes to housing. So only when, there's a broader spectrum of society, only when the middle classes are also affected all of a sudden of this contradiction between housing as a commodity and housing as a basic need, only then politics cares. and media cares. So this is the kind of window of opportunity there is to change certain housing politics, and that's also what happened in Germany in response to this protest. But the response then usually was to satisfy the needs of the middle classes, and thereby put the pressure out of this topic. And so and this is one strategy to divide them, of course, to satisfy the needs of one group and not the one of the other. So that would be one problem. The other one that comes from external to the social movement, but also within social movements, it's always very difficult to have equal representation, for example, of the diverse people involved, because obviously middle class people with a university degree speak the same language as city officials do, and others might not, and they might raise their voice because they are very upset, and that is not appreciated in participation processes, for example, and so on. So there's internal problems from this alliance. So there's a constant need to reestablish this relationship between middle classes and more marginalized poorer classes. And to I'm in contrast to Mustafa, I'm a strategic optimist. So I tend to see the positive things and highlight them and hope they grow. And so within Tenant, the Tenant movement in Berlin, I think there's been some, not everywhere, but some quite successful attempts to also talk about racist exclusion, to incorporate the position this kind of essentialized subject position you were talking about, including it when talking about displacement and gentrification, and making it one topic, and thereby not forcing people to only talk about their whatever Turkish migration background or something, but to talk about their right to stay put where they are, and by also discussing it as a racist problem of racism. So I think this, intersectional, or whatever you want to call it, this putting these economic issues and identitarian issues together has been at least successful in some attempts. But for the negative problems I see mostly with Tenant movement is that they're so localized. They're due to their nature being rooted in specific houses or housing developments where the people are affected, they're hyper localized. They're not even neighborhood-wide organizations, but they're really super local organizations. It's very hard to form networks across all of these very localized initiatives. And you can see that in politics in Germany. So maybe in Berlin, housing politics is a hot topic and has been used for electoral politics and is very important. But already on the national level in Germany, it's hardly ever discussed. It's not an important political topic. It's given very little attention and so on, even though I think it affects a lot of people and would interest a lot of people, but it's not represented in institutional politics on the federal level. So the local trap is one of the big issues, I think, is a problem. And the other one, more internal to the movement, is that, as I said before, it has to start building structures from scratch. But it has to do that, and that's very difficult if people are not educated in how to organize, for example. So most of what's happening are classical political campaigns that with mobilizing people to this one demonstration, or now mobilizing people to sign for the referendum to expropriate financialized housing companies. But we need a longer path than that, even if that referendum is won, which we don't know yet. But even if it is won, the city will not, just expropriate these companies just like that. The pressure needs to go on. So we need a really well-organized basis that is able to act and put pressure on politics for a long time. And so I think organizing has become a more prominent theme in the Tenant movement, or in also other movements in Berlin, the techniques of how to organize people into long-term structures and not only mobilize them for certain events. That would be, I think, one condition for a more transformative movement.
Great. Thanks so much. This has already been extremely rich and intriguing, the discussion we had and the answers that both of you gave to our questions. So thanks so much for that already.